Dr. Murthy, I just want to start by saying, so in preparing for this conversation, I came across a very exciting piece of information, which is I believe you and I went to the same middle school.
What? Martine,
Yeah,
really?
Palmetto
Oh,
Middle,
oh my gosh.
home of the Lancers.
Yes,
Um,
that is right. Oh my
I,
gosh. I haven't heard Lancers in years. Wow.
yeah. And I just remember them because we had these like horrible orange shorts in gym classes
Yes,
with like
I
the,
remember. Yep, I remember
yeah,
those. Yep,
yeah.
totally.
That is Dr. Vivek Murthy. And in addition to being a proud alumnus of Palmetto Middle School in Miami-Dade County, he is the United States Surgeon General, basically the nation's top physician. So he thinks a lot about the well-being of kids in the U.S.
I've often wondered, is middle school hard all over the world, or is it just America? Sometimes I wonder.
Dr. Murthy did not have a great time in middle school, but who did? I can tell you plenty of stories of my Palmetto Middle experience. My classmates' not-so-nice reaction to my intense orthodontics. The one kid in 7th grade who told me that my hair looked like Don King. And as you'll hear in this episode, Dr. Murthy has his own stories to share about the particular bullying that he experienced in woodshop and what got him through.
But I do think that the experience of bullying, which a lot of us had, the one thing that I was grateful for is that I feel like when I came home, I had a refuge from it.
Mm.
One of the things I worry about right now is that for young people who are being bullied online, there is no refuge. There's no safe place to go, especially when you feel like you can't get off of social media. You're constantly on it. It's coming at you 24/7. And like, just think about those dark moments when young people are up at night at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., scrolling through their feeds, getting bullied and harassed. There's nobody around them.
Murthy has been at the forefront of a movement to really scrutinize the impact of social media and its potential harms, and to think meaningfully about how we as a society can intervene. It's an issue that's been debated all the way up to the Supreme Court, even in a decision that came out today, which you'll hear about later in the show. In Murthy's view, social media is a public health issue, same as how he's tried to make the case that loneliness and isolation are public health issues. And last week, he issued a striking recommendation, a way to alert people about the potential harms for kids being online. He wants to put warning labels on social media, but he might be facing an uphill battle. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Wednesday, June 26th. Today, my conversation with the Surgeon General. We talked about the perils of social media, and we also talked about his latest advisory announced this week, focusing on the threat of gun violence to America's health. But first, we go back to middle school. So I want to ask you about the experiences of children and how some of the policies that you're advising might affect the experiences of children. I think it's important to establish your credentials here. So can I ask, what was middle school like for you?
Middle school, goodness. I found middle school to be a really mixed experience. On the one hand, I met some folks who were wonderful friends, and one of them remains a friend and is the piano teacher for my kids to this day.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. On the other hand, it was challenging. I was changing and developing a lot and trying to figure out who I was. But I also did encounter a fair amount of bullying in middle school, which was challenging. And, as a shy, introverted kid, it wasn't always so easy to fit into a new school as well. I remember my woodshop class in 7th grade, which was, which was fun on the one hand. I was like making all kinds of cool stuff with wood, and that was great. But I also remember these two kids who, and it was very peculiar. I remember this one kid in particular who just moved to town, and I thought, well, let me go and try to be friendly with him because he's new and he doesn't know anyone. And he was very friendly for like a couple of weeks. And then all of a sudden he just turned into this bully who was like relentlessly making fun of me because of the color of my skin, because my parents were from India, and he was trying to get other kids involved in the bullying as well. So it turned a class that I really enjoyed and loved into a class I dreaded, and I often think about that. But there's a bright side to that as well, which is that I think about another student in that class, Eric Fong, who one day after a few weeks of this going on actually came over to the table and said, "I'm not going to let you guys talk to my friend that way." And I will always remember him because he didn't really know me that well, but he stood up for me, and he could have just turned the other way and kept going about his business. But he saw something happening that wasn't right, and he intervened. And I'll always be grateful to Eric Fong for that.
Oh my gosh, what a hero.
Yeah.
Shout out to Eric. Well, I think what's so interesting about that is that it can feel very easy to have these generalizations of like, in the before times, childhood used to be easy. Now childhood is much more complicated. And I think that we all know that like that's not exactly the case, that a lot of people had complicated, difficult times in middle school or high school and were bullied. And yet things are different now because, you and I were part of the last couple of generations that didn't have access to social media, weren't experiencing all these things through the lens of having constant access to your phone and, the ability to post selfies and see what your classmates are posting. And I'm curious, when you look back on your experiences in middle school, imperfect as they were, what are you worried about that students and young people are experiencing now with social media? Like, how does your experience get more complicated when you add, an Instagram or a TikTok or what have you into the mix?
So I think there are two things that social media has done in particular to adolescents, which have been very problematic. One is that it has taken experiences that were challenging always for young people, whether it was bullying or comparing yourself to other people, and it has dramatically magnified and accelerated those. So when I was being bullied in middle school, for example, the bullying stopped after I left woodshop. But if you do something, let's say silly, in class, in my case, if I did that, 30 people knew about it, and then I went home. But these days, that stays with you on social media. Thousands of people may be viewing the video that was taken. Your shame may be dramatically magnified. And the bullying also doesn't stop when you leave school. If it's happening online, then you may be harassed and bullied around the clock. And that is just fundamentally different. For many kids, there is no respite from that. So that the magnification of old challenges is one aspect of social media. But the second aspect is that there are new challenges that it introduces. The fact that kids are now exposed to violent and sexual content online in ways that 8, 9, 10-year-olds weren't before, that is a profound challenge. The fact that strangers now can contact you on social media and in often cases can manipulate and exploit and in some cases even blackmail kids, often at great expense and cost to their own mental health and well-being. That was not happening before. Sure, you always had to be worried about strangers in real life, but the notion that 24/7 strangers could be coming at you and trying to contact you and exploit you, like that was not a reality when I was growing up. So I just think that we have to recognize that, yes, while there have been inflections in technology over the years that have changed our life, whether it was the phone or television or long before that, books and the printing press.
But that you see this is different.
This is fundamentally different because it has transformed childhood. It has fundamentally transformed relationships and our interactions with one another. And it is pervasive in our lives in a way that prior technology never was.
So you have a proposal for how to pull children away from social media through warning labels. Can you explain, what would that actually look like? What are you advising here?
So my suggestion around warning labels is part of a larger set of strategies I've suggested to address the harms of social media. And that's really important to consider because you might think, well, a warning label, is that really going to fix everything? No, but it's not intended to fix everything. A warning label is intended to warn people about the harms that we are seeing associated with social media use among adolescents. And what we've learned actually from experience with tobacco and alcohol labels is that these labels actually do work to increase awareness and change behavior. In the case of social media, this would be a digital warning label that would pop up regularly when you used your social media account. The exact text on the warning, whether there are pictorial elements to it, how often it appears, those are elements that would be determined in a scientific process of testing out different versions of the label. That's what we do, in fact, with alcohol and tobacco labels. But the broader set of changes that we need to see with social media, in addition to the label, involve, number one, putting in place safety guardrails to protect kids from harmful content and from bullying and harassment. We need also requirements that protect kids from features that would seek to manipulate their developing adolescent brains into excessive use. And keep in mind, these features are often designed by some of the best product engineers in the world, by some of the most well-resourced companies in the world to maximize how much time our kids are spending on the platform.
Essentially make them addictive, right?
Yeah, and that's why actually a third of kids say they feel addicted to social media. Like half of them say it would be very hard for them to reduce or eliminate their use if they had to. And that's not because young people are deficient in willpower compared to prior generations. Young people today have just as much willpower as prior generations, but their digital environment is profoundly different. If I grew up, Martine, with social media in its current form, I would have really struggled as a kid. And that's not to say, again, that social media is all bad. There are benefits that some kids can get from social media. I detailed, in fact, some of these benefits in my 2023 advisory on social media and youth mental health.
Well, forgive me for interrupting you, but I want to ask a little bit more about that, because I have seen arguments that push back against this, that say that the evidence so far is insufficient to make a clear connection between teen mental health struggles and use of social media. And thinking back to your experience in middle school, I do feel like you're an example of someone who could have benefited from having a community of kids online, or people who are not in your class, who you had some common interest with that you could find, and even if you're being bullied at school, could have this other community of kids your age who see you for being awesome and want to connect with you, and I think that's the example we talk about, especially with LGBTQ youth who are often in situations that are isolated, and that social media is an opportunity for connection and less loneliness. So what do you say to that pushback?
Well, I think you have to look at the big picture here. First of all, the people who argue that social media is not the sole contributor to the youth mental health crisis, I agree with that. It's not the sole contributor, but it is an important contributor. Second, for people who might say, well, there are people who get benefits of social media, so it must be good for you. Well, you can benefit from a product or service and be harmed by it as well. You see this, in fact, all the time happen. Think about medications that can benefit your health in some way but have very bad side effects, right? You have to balance the benefits and the harms when you're determining whether it's worthwhile in terms of taking a product. And look, we do this all the time with products that children use, whether it's car seats or the foods they consume, the medications they take, the cars they get into and drive when they turn 15 or 16 years old. We try to make them as safe as possible to minimize the harms. The fact that there are some benefits of social media make it all the more important that we address the harms, because we've put kids in a very difficult situation right now where to get some of these benefits, whether it's finding a community online or expressing yourself creatively, you have to endure bullying and harassment, often from strangers as well as the people you know. You have to endure content that maybe you didn't seek out, but that finds you anyway, that harms and impacts your mental health. And you often find, and this is what young people tell me all the time, around the country, that even though they know that they should reduce their use, even though they want to spend less time on the platforms, they often feel like they can't. They often start by saying, okay, I'm just going to check for 10 minutes. And then 2 hours later, they are still there. Again, it's not an accident.
And that's not a teen thing. I think that's an everybody thing. I experience that all the time.
Well, yeah, a lot of adults experience that too. But the bottom line is that some benefits do not justify the harms that we're seeing right now. And our failure to make social media safer has really hurt kids over the years. Social media has been around for 20 years, Martine. This didn't just crop up yesterday or last year on the scene. And the harms that we've been witnessing have been mounting during that time. And that's one of the reasons I've called for action to be taken to make social media safer, to demand and require transparency from the companies in terms of the data they have about this mental health impact of their platforms. Because researchers right now tell us all the time that they cannot get all the information that they need, that the companies have, to understand the full impact on the mental health of young people. And that is just wrong.
To be clear, when it comes to, well, specifically the warning label idea, this is something that you can't put in place yourself, that this is something that Congress would need to enact. But you talked about like just this need for better regulation to force these companies to be more public about the data that they have. A lot of that is in Congress's hands. But as we've seen over the past couple of decades, like legislators have been very reticent or incapable of putting in place meaningful regulation. And it seems like some of this, at least the warning labels, is more aimed at like kids and their parents and giving them more information, but that really the place where there isn't a lot of movement is forcing the companies that run these social media platforms to do business differently. Do you feel like Congress has got their priorities in the wrong place when it comes to tech regulation?
Well, I fully agree that the most important thing for Congress to do is to make the platform safer. And I laid out steps that they could take to do that. And a warning label would be something that would exist to warn people about safety issues until such a point came where social media was made safer. But the one thing I'd say I'm encouraged by is that over the last few years, we have seen more bipartisan support and just more support overall among lawmakers for taking action to address the harms of social media. But as I've said directly to members of Congress, and I've said publicly, until legislation is actually passed at a federal level and implemented that makes social media safer, the experience of kids isn't going to change enough. And that's why I feel a great sense of urgency about this, not just as Surgeon General, but as a parent myself. And it's why I've urged Congress to actually get the job done here and to step up, because this is an area we have neglected for nearly 20 years. And something I know from my own practice of medicine and from being a part of responding to public health emergencies during 2 terms as Surgeon General is that if you see a public health crisis unfolding, and when you have enough evidence to act, if you delay acting because you just have more research questions you want to answer, the cost of inaction can be measured in lives lost and in human suffering. And that is what we are seeing happen today.
We're going to take a quick break. And after, I ask Dr. Murthy how these tough questions about social media are playing out in his own house with his own kids. We'll be right back. Can I ask, do you let your kids use social media?
So my kids are 6 and 7, and even they're not on social media. But interestingly, it doesn't mean they haven't asked about it, because my daughter, even when she was
6 and 7, I don't think is like particularly young to start stumbling into Instagram and looking at the pretty photos. But carry on.
So my daughter asked about posting a picture on social media when she was in preschool, because her preschool classmates were talking about it. But we do not allow our children to use social media. My wife and I have talked about this a lot. We are going to wait until at least after middle school to consider allowing them to be on social media. And even then, we're going to reassess based on their maturity, based on the safety data at that point, and based on whether safety standards that we've called for have actually been put in place. But Martine, I know that this is not easy to do, right? Because I've heard all the time from parents that when your child comes up to you and says, everyone else in class has a social media account and they're all talking and sharing information, and I'm going to be left out if I don't have an account, then it's really hard as a parent, right? You don't want your child to be isolated or left out. So what are you supposed to do? Well, in those circumstances, this is why I think it's so important for parents to actually be able to partner and help one another. If we can not only talk more openly about our struggles as parents managing social media. And by the way, it's hard for all of us.
And to be able to say, like, well, the Surgeon General told me that it's really bad for my kid at this age to be on social media. So it's not my decision. I'm just going along with what the advice is.
Well, and I'm hopeful that that would be helpful too. In fact, one recent study showed that 75% of parents said that if there was a warning from the Surgeon General about the harms of social media, that would make them more likely to put restrictions and limits on their teens' use of social media. But the other thing that talking and partnering with parents allows us to do is to ensure that our kids aren't the only ones who are subject to limits when it comes to social media, right? So if I can tell my kids, you're not the only one who's waiting until after middle school, but Martine's kids are, and Annie's kids are, and Bob's kids are as well, and you know them, then they'll feel less alone, and it'll be easier for us as parents.
Dr. Murthy, in the time that we have left, I do want to pivot away from social media and ask you about this new advisory that you put out this week that essentially declares gun violence to be a public health crisis. And I think that's kind of, a surprising headline for people to process because unlike social media, I think that, you would ask most people in this country and say like, oh, is gun violence like harmful to people? And be like, yeah, gun violence is bad for communities, bad for families. It is a problem. Why was this something that you wanted to put out an advisory about, and what does that mean?
Well, Martine, the toll of gun violence on our country is far bigger than I think most people imagine. I've long believed that gun violence is a public health issue, in part stemming from my own experiences as a doctor taking care of patients who were the victims of gun violence and just seeing the profound both physical and mental health consequences for them and for their families. But as Surgeon General, as I've traveled around the country talking to people, I've heard the issue of social media, the issue of gun violence come up all the time, particularly from young people. And this is really disturbing, but so many middle school students have told me around the country that they are worried about a shooting in their school. High school students have told me that they hear gunshots when they walk around in their neighborhood, so now they're scared about going outside to take a walk literally in their own neighborhood. I had a mom I was talking to not that long ago who tragically had been present during a mass shooting that had taken place at a public event. And she happened to be in flip-flops at the time. And it was hard to run away from the shooter in flip-flops. And so to this day, whenever she goes out, she hesitates to wear flip-flops because she never knows if there's going to be another incident where she's going to have to run from a shooter. When you understand these stories, you start to realize that fear of gun violence has infiltrated the psyche of America. It has traumatized both our physical bodies as well as our minds. And the data actually backs that up. Right now, 54% of Americans have either directly or through their family member experienced gun violence, whether that's losing a family member, being shot or threatened yourself. But we also know that 6 out of 10 Americans are now worried about losing a loved one to gun violence. And painfully, half of our kids, slightly more than half, in fact, are concerned about a shooting taking place in their school. Like, this is not how we should have to live as Americans. We should not tolerate this as some sort of new normal. But most disturbing of all for me as a parent is just recognizing that gun violence has now become the leading cause of death among children and teens. And this was not true a decade ago. It was not true 2 decades ago. It is true today. And that's why by issuing an advisory on gun violence, I wanted to help the public understand the broader reverberations of gun violence, these cascading harms that millions of people are experiencing in the country. And I also wanted them to know that this is a kids' issue. We've got to approach this with the urgency that it deserves because it's our kids' health and well-being that's at stake.
Yeah. Well, let me ask more about that because, you mentioned that this is basically about our community treating gun violence like a public health issue that it is. But at the same time, again, we talked about the fears that so many parents and children have. And, I know that I have those kinds of fears every day when I walk into public places and, have to think about what would happen if, a mass shooting took place here. And I think that's like a profound fear that so many people are carrying with them every day. And to that point, like, why do we need a Surgeon General to tell us that? So I guess what I'm asking here is, like, what changes because of this advisory? Given the fact that so many people are already so worried about this and scarred by this, how does putting a Surgeon General advisory about gun violence change the game here?
So there are three things that can change with the Surgeon General's advisory. The first is when our office issues publications on health issues, that is a way we've had historically, going back decades, of calling the country's attention to prioritize a public health concern. It's what we did, during my term with the issue of loneliness and isolation, to put that on the map as a concern. It's what Luther Terry, my predecessor, did in 1964 around smoking.
In the history of the world, no non-essential habit ever got so entrenched so fast. 70 million Americans smoke. Today they got a message from the United States Surgeon General.
Out of its long and exhaustive deliberations, the committee has reached the overall judgment that cigarette smoking is a health hazard of sufficient importance to the United States to warrant remedial action.
So it prioritizes the public health issues we have to focus on as a nation. The second thing an advisory does is it helps people understand the true nature of a problem. I think commonly we think of the toll of gun violence as the lives that we lose, and appropriately so, because the nearly 50,000 lives we lose are the greatest price we pay. But the reverberations that impact now millions of people in our country, I think, are underappreciated. When we recognize that, when we also recognize that the fears we may be feeling around gun violence are not felt by us alone, but are more broadly experienced by others, that increases the urgency that people feel to take action. But the third thing that can change with these advisories is action. We lay out in this advisory a series of strategies that we can take as a country to help reduce the toll of gun violence. These include steps that lawmakers can consider. They include steps that healthcare organizations, community organizations, and individuals can consider as well. And these can make a difference. If we see gun violence for what it is, as a public health issue that's impacting all of us, my hope is that we can then take these strategies and employ the public health approach that helped us reduce the toll of smoking, reduce motor vehicle accident-related deaths in the 80s and 90s. If we take that same approach here, I believe we can save lives and we can ultimately reduce the suffering we're seeing today.
Do you see similarities between this gun violence advisory and the social media warning labels advisory in terms of issues that I think a lot of Americans don't think of as public health issues right now?
It's interesting. I would say that these are perhaps issues that have not traditionally been talked about from the Office of the Surgeon General or maybe from departments of public health. But intuitively, people know that these impact their health. You know, the people who inspired me and compelled me to do our work on social media were parents across the country who everywhere I went across America would ask me the most common question, which was, is social media safe for my kids? They were worried it wasn't. They were concerned this was impacting the mental health of their kids. And similarly with gun violence, look, for anyone who has lived in fear of gun violence or who has experienced it directly, they know that it's a health issue. You don't show up in a hospital or in a mental health clinic or struggle with PTSD with things that are not health issues. This is a health issue that we're talking about here. So I do think that the public knows more broadly. I think the fact that we haven't been talking about this in public health is a problem. I do think that we have to increasingly in public health understand that technology across the board is impacting our health, and we have to be thoughtful about how we address that so that we get the benefits of tech without the harms. I think we should be thinking about this particularly with artificial intelligence, which is increasingly, present in our lives and can have major benefits, but can also potentially have significant downsides and harms if we're not aware of the health impacts and looking at AI through a public health lens.
Interesting. AI as a public health issue is not a thing that I had on my mind right now.
I'll tell you, though, with AI, just think about it for a moment. If you've got technology that affects the kind of information that you're getting and could perhaps increase the flow of incorrect health information to you, right, and mislead you about your health. If you have products or services that are being developed that are telling you, you know what, you don't actually need friends or a spouse or kids or anyone in your life, because an AI bot can just understand you and what your interests are and your needs by scraping your past posts and data, and can just be that replacement for you. So why do you need to go out and meet people, right? That sounds like a convenient, in quotes, solution here. But AI cannot fully replace human beings. It can lure us into thinking it can. And so this is why we have to be thoughtful. Like, we need to make sure, if we had taken this approach, a thoughtful approach with social media years ago, I dare say we would have platforms now that could truly benefit children without exposing them to extraordinary harms. We didn't take that approach, and we're living with the consequences of that today. One thing I do want to say is about why I believe it's not only important but possible to feel hopeful about making change on these two areas. Because sometimes I worry that people look at all of the challenges we're dealing with in the world, at all of the barriers to making progress, and they say, gosh, is it really feasible to do anything about these issues, or are they just intractable? Is gun violence and the harms of social media just part of the new normal? And I don't think we have to accept that it is, but I also think that there's evidence that tells us that it doesn't have to be either. Like, think about social media, and 5 years ago, I did not see the kind of conversations that we're having about social media in the public square. I did not see the kind of organization that's building among parents, the movement among parents, to actually band together and address the harms of social media. And I didn't see the kind of bipartisan growing support among policymakers at a federal and state level to say, you know what, this is affecting all of our kids. We've got to do something about it. Similarly with gun violence, 5-6 years ago, Congress finally provided some modest funding for gun violence research. They've got to do a lot more. But that was the first time in decades that they had done that. And 2 years ago, they passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the first federal legislation to address gun violence in nearly 30 years, again, which many people did not think was possible. So these are important steps, but they shouldn't be the last steps that we take. There's a lot more we have to do. But what we've done in the past, the support that's building in the public for taking action in these areas, these all give me hope that we can build the kind of energy and focus and urgency that we need to ultimately protect our kids, both from the harms of social media and from the terrible toll of gun violence.
Dr. Murthy, thank you for taking this time to speak with me.
Thanks so much, Martine. I really enjoyed this conversation. Appreciate you. Hey, just tell me, Martine, before you go, though, which magnet school did you go to?
I went to Coral Reef.
Oh, Coral Reef. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I did like the IB program there, which was very controversial at the time. Like, halfway through my freshman year, I was like, maybe I should go back to Palmetto where I actually have friends.
Oh.
Dr. Vivek Murthy is the United States Surgeon General. We recorded this conversation on Tuesday afternoon. Then, on Wednesday morning, the Supreme Court released a major decision in which Murthy is named as a defendant. The case against the government was all about whether the Biden administration could address disinformation and potentially problematic posts on social media. In a 6-3 decision, the court issued a narrow ruling. They said that the conservative state leaders who were the challengers did not have the legal standing to bring the case against the Biden administration. We reached back out to Dr. Murthy's office. They didn't have a comment by the time we published our show. It turns out that I was not the only one in the Post newsroom intrigued by Dr. Murthy's proposal for social media warnings. My colleagues on the opinions desk have been talking about this a lot. And in the most recent episode of their podcast Impromptu, they chatted about smartphones, dumb phones, anxiety about teen mental health, and whether they think warnings about things that are bad for kids actually work. Like when music labels put explicit language warnings on tapes and CDs.
Yeah, and I remember when those warnings, explicit warnings, appeared, I feel like they made the music seem more attractive,
yes,
not less.
The sticker, I would not have bought NWA or 2 Live Crew or any of these groups, except for the sticker.
That is on this week's episode of Impromptu. Subscribe to the show in your podcast app. We'll also link to the episode in our show notes and at postreports.com. Before we wrap today's show, we've got some updates from key elections in Tuesday's primaries. In New York, Congressman Jamal Bowman has become the first House Democratic incumbent to lose a primary this year. Here's his concession from Tuesday night.
This movement has always been about justice. It has always been about humanity. It has always been about equality. And it has always been about our collective liberation.
Bowman is a member of the group informally known as the Squad. He was defeated by George Latimer, Westchester County executive. And this primary resurrected old rivalries between the Democratic Party establishment and the far left. Bowman was endorsed by Senator Bernie Sanders. Latimer was endorsed by Hillary Clinton. The campaign raised issues around age and race and money in politics and policies on war in the Middle East. And the fact that Bowman lost represents a major blow to the most liberal contingent of the House Democratic Caucus. We also had a notable election in Colorado.
Glory to God! Glory to God!
Republican Congresswoman Lauren Boebert won her primary in a new district after deciding not to seek re-election in her current, more competitive district. That's it for today's episode of Post Reports, which was produced by Alana Gordon, mixed by Sean Carter, and edited by Ariel Plotnick with help from Rena Flores and Lucy Perkins. Thank you also to Stephen Smith. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.